Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining this online session of the Hong Kong Biennale. Today is our curatorial conversation number 9, communicating and delivering sustainability. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for our main organizer, the Hong Kong Institute of Architects Biennale Foundation, and our the Biennale co-organizer, Hong Kong Design Association and Hong Kong Institute of Planners. Of course, we won't be here without our title sponsor, DBS Bank, who's kindly, their commitment to sustainability is very much in line with one of our themes, which is also the theme of this talk today. So thank you to DBS. And also in this event, although it's an online event, we do have a event venue sponsor, so in the studio, so to speak, it's HK Music. So thank you very much to HK Music Foundation for the support in providing this venue. And for this particular event, the co-organizer is also RIBA Hong Kong chapter, and you will, from the audience and from the speakers, international speakers, there's a lot of very high connection with the RIBA. So for those of you who are new to this series of talk, you can also see our previous event, curatorial conversation number 8, on competitions on our YouTube channel. And we have also lined up some future events, which I will probably go through at the end of this session, so to introduce a number of things that we've lined up for you with equally engaging topics as well as equally interesting speakers and panelists. So watch this space. And it will be in the same format, it will be in the same time, same place. So if you're interested, if you find this interesting, keep your Thursday evening or afternoon if you're in earlier, sort of midday, 11:30 time in the UK. Keep that time slot free for the next few Thursday, and please join us. But having said that, all these events are recorded, so an edited version will be available on our YouTube channel as well. Now, obviously, just to go back a little bit about the main topic, the topic itself, it revolves around the main title of our Biennale, in the Hong Kong Biennale 2019, which is what we call 2x2, imagine to innovate. So the idea is that we all should have innovate, in order for innovation and technology to work for us, we should all have imagination about our cities. So with the imagination will come out of demand, and then without demand, all the technologies and all the innovators will have to deliver this kind of our imagination of the city. So the idea is to encourage our imagination. And then 3 key sub-themes are identity, livability, and sustainability. And it is with sustainability that we've created this series of talks. And obviously mainly to do with, because of the COVID-19, the events that was in February and March, which we were supposed to gather a lot of people, who couldn't happen anymore. So that's why we're delivering these series online as instead, which has been, which is quite well received so far. So now, this event, where did it start? Well, it started a little while ago when I was in an RIBA council meeting, when a colleague, a fellow council member, presented the RIBA Climate Challenge 2030 to us, and I thought it was a great presentation. It was a great initiative, and then it got me I try and find out a bit more about it, and then I come across things like Architects Declare, and come across things like One Planet Living, etc., etc. These very interesting sustainability initiatives. Now, but then the question becomes. What was very interesting for us for me was that how do we communicate these with the general public in not too specialist kind of level and not too technical or academic, because these initiatives are about the delivery of sustainability. And by delivery, I don't necessarily mean the kind of industry standards like the BREEAM of the UK, the BEAM Pro in Hong Kong, plus in Hong Kong, or the LEED system in the US, which I see them, it's not like a badge of honor that you wear, but what you do, what does it mean if you have gold or platinum? What does it actually mean? I don't know whether you've heard about that story in some buildings in Hong Kong where, they get credits for providing bicycle parking.
That's good.
That's good, but then they don't provide showers at the end, and I think it's a bit of a death wish if you want to cycle to work in Hong Kong. So if you get into the office, that is, and if you get into the office, you don't even get a chance to have a shower. So hence, it's interesting for me to curate this about communicating to how we as architects, as designers, we all have all these standards, but how we communicate these ideas to the public, and how we these concepts, to explain these concepts to a wider public, and that's why I was very interested in this. And the international speakers we have today: Ian Taylor from Feilden Clegg Bradley Studio, and James Aldwood from Allies and Morrison. James Woodall from Allies and Morrison. I will talk about, I'll introduce them to you properly later. They've been chosen according to what I was talking about earlier. But what I want to do is introduce our studio guests first. So to my left is Professor Dr. Winnie Law. So I was just saying earlier, Winnie is the Deputy Director, let me get it right, Deputy Director and Principal Lecturer for the Center of Civic Society and Governance of the University of Hong Kong. So I got that right. Okay, thank you. And she will explain a little bit more what that means. And Winnie and I have just realized that we met many years ago. And
10 years or more.
Yeah, but we reconnected through this. No less thanks to my co-curator Sarah Nui who reconnected us. And we were talking about public consultation, I think, at the time about our project. So actually, without further ado, I'll hand the mic to you to explain to you what that long title means and what you do and what you think of the topic so far.
Thank you, Roger, for inviting me. It's a pleasure so mine. I was actually trained as a community planner, specializing in urban regeneration projects. So I worked through a participatory social impact assessment with the affected neighbors or stakeholders in the communities. And gradually what I do now at the center that I'm with right now, quite a bit of my time actually spent on working with various stakeholders in the communities, carrying out what we call action research projects on sustainability. So our ultimate goal is to attain sustainability, not actually just communicating sustainability, but attaining sustainability through partnerships and collaborations. So for example, we're currently working on a village revitalization project. So we work with the rural communities, the villages, and other interested parties in looking at how we can move the sustainability transition forward. Not just doing recycling or cycling stuff at the village, but also help them to reorganize their village governance so that the governance itself would embrace principles of sustainability. So that kind of things. We also worked on projects that can provide support and capacity buildings and networking for social entrepreneurs. So our target is to cultivate some kind of sustainability catalyzer, which we think they are the change makers that can pursue sustainability when they deliver their social missions through maybe a business model. So our idea is to cultivate and support all these social innovations so that they can help attain sustainability. So these are just a couple of examples of what I do right now. I'm sure we can share a bit more later when we hear what the international speakers will present.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Winnie. So to my right is Ren. Ren is, I met Ren for the first time today, but again, he was introduced through my co-curator, Sarah. And Ren is from a very, very different background, which is exactly what I like about these sessions, where no pressure on the international speaker. So we all from different backgrounds. So not necessarily to challenge you, but to see if it makes sense to different stakeholders of society, different people from different perspectives and different kind of background. So Ren is a co-founder of Zhap Ye. So I'll leave you to explain that in English. Because Zhap Ye is actually a very Cantonese phrase. And also managing director of West East magazine. So two quite interesting initiatives, but perhaps not quite familiar by a number of our audience, which come from different parts of the world and so on, and but no less interesting. So I'll hand the mic to you, Ren, and tell us a bit more about what you do and what you want to hear.
Okay, thank you, Roger.
I used to be the managing editor of Leslie's magazine. That was actually my first job and the only full-time job in my career. But yeah, I was trained. I was not trained for the environmental protection or conservation or sustainability. I didn't come from that background. I was trained as a media, as a magazine editor. So that is why I'm really passionate about how to deliver messages to people, because you can't just feed them with information without engaging them or arousing their interest. You have to really talk in their language. So it is what I'm really passionate about. So, but because when I was working as a correspondent for another magazine, that was based in Beijing, and I did a lot of stories about the environment and sustainability, and that's how I came across that word, and that's aroused my interest to take I actually tried to take my postgrad diploma from University of London on sustainable development. So I have some knowledge about that, but I didn't complete that course yet. Yeah, so I know a little bit. I know the terms, I know the theories, but I'm not as expert level as Winnie. So that is why I founded my organization in 2011. That was like 9 years ago. We didn't want to be a green finger group at that time. So because we think that actually the environment or the heart for the environment, the care for the environment should not be framed only on experts or the conservationists, or just not for the environmental groups only. So it's all about the lifestyle of everybody. So we try to skip the green image and we just throw fun, urban, hip activities that arouse the general public's joy. So what exactly do we do? 執嘢 actually in Cantonese it means taking stuff and how to say tidying up stuff at home. So at that time, like 9 years ago, we were trying to address to the problem of overconsumption, because it's still very popular in Hong Kong. And it still is. I think it still is. And I think most general people do not really know how critical the problem of waste is actually is in Hong Kong. And we just see the two problems back then, just overconsumption and excessive waste. And so we think that actually back then we thought that swapping, just by the simple action of swapping, it can actually engage people to try to reduce overconsumption and to reduce waste. So we don't just throw everything to landfill. So we just try to organize public activities back then. And then throughout the 9 years, we have public events that besides swapping, we also have other sustainability related events like having sharing sessions like today, what we are doing now, or we have workshops for people to learn craftsmanship so they know how to upcycle by themselves, and we have a music performance that actually we think are trying to embed like spiritual enlightenment to people. So and maybe it doesn't sound like relevant to sustainability, but we think that if we try to get people away or we brainwash them with some other messages, like higher, like more meaningful messages to them, so they will get away from overconsumption, because we think that actually that's an urban problem, only because people are too empty, or they do not really they can't really find satisfaction in their lives, and so that's why they shop so much. So that's what we try to do. And we also have like second-hand clothing sharing on the street. We have a bike. We actually call this mobile wardrobe, and we actually, because we can collect a lot of second-hand clothes, and we try to just get them on the bike, and then we just go on the street and then deliver in the middle of the shopping district for free. So we did it quite several times, and there were actually a lot of people who were used to shop around those shopping malls, and they just came and say like, okay, this looks good. so can I? Well, how much is this? And they were, it's free, second hand. So we are trying to use this approach to get them to know more about the issue of overconsumption and how how serious the problem of fashion waste is, and that is what we do. So, but why I'm really interested in today's conversation because we don't actually come from we skip all the sustainability related jargons in what we do, in everywhere we do. We don't talk about carbon footprint, and we don't talk about environmental protection. These kind of terms never really have an important place in what we do with our communication with the public. So yeah, that's why I'm really looking forward to today's conversation.
So you've thrown down the gauntlet. Now, international speakers, you've got 2 minutes to take out all the technical jargons in your presentation. Well, just joking, obviously.
I actually read just this morning. I think I downloaded the toolkit from One Planet Living's website, and I really like the term, the introduction. I saw the term "live happily." I think that doesn't sound like sustainability related, but I think that's the best way we can. The best words we can use to engage the public to lead a sustainable life. Excellent.
So, without further ado, I will start introducing my speakers. And I've just been told my colleague has just shown me a list of people who've joined the sessions. Welcome to those who just joined. Excuse me, I wasn't being rude, but I've been messages for people who just joining, or people who tried to join who couldn't join. So I've been responding to them. So hello everybody, and if be engaged, and if you have any questions, do send a message in Zoom, or if you have my number, WhatsApp me. I will read them out too later. So anyway, so the first speaker is Ian. Ian is a managing director of a UK architectural firm, Feilden Clegg Bradley Studios. Now, when I started out as an architecture student, we just Feilden Clegg, and funny enough, Feilden Clegg Bradley, I was taught by almost all three of them when I was at University of Bath. So there we go. It's gone. I wouldn't say how long ago it was, but it was a long, long time ago. And they are no strangers not only to me, but they're actually not strangers to some of our people behind the screen, because I've heard that there are a few University of Bath students who's also joining the session. But they're no stranger to sustainability, because even when I was a student, although it hasn't been labeled as such, but that kind of green living, the idea of not sustainability in its kind of technical term, but sustainable community. So it has been an idea that's always been there, kind of in the way they work, and always in the back of my mind to draw them into this conversation, into Hong Kong Biennale. And when I was in London, lucky there was a luxury when I was able to travel. Kind of last towards the end of last year, I went to the exhibition called Carbon Count, which was fantastic. I mean, it was basically, we all talk about, as you said, carbon footprint, 1 kilogram, how many kilograms of carbon dioxide and so on. But what does it mean? What does it mean? What does it look like? And so on. And that exhibition in London was a physical manifestation of what it relates to. So using different, well, actually I shouldn't say too much about it, because Ian's going to talk about it. But I love it so much that I didn't bring it physically, obviously, then there would be too much carbon footprint for doing that. But we brought the digital version to Hong Kong in our interactive display panel in the Hong Kong Biennale. So without further ado, I will pass the mic on to Ian to communicate what it is all about. Thank you very much, Ian.
Okay, thank you, Roger. And certainly I think the really interesting piece about this, the time we're living in, is this issue about how we communicate the issue, and how that is two ways really. One is how it's communicated within the public realm to the people for whom we design things and places for their use, but also how we communicate it within our project teams. The context of last year was very significant with the IPCC reports and the instigation of Architects Declare, and a whole uprising internationally of concern in the environment. So I'm going to discuss what we're doing about it as a practice, and some of the approaches we're taking. And I'm going to refer back to the 11 points in the Architects Declare Declaration. And the 4 topics I'm going to cover are, firstly, and everyone has to commit to the issue, and there's a lot to be done in order to get there. You've got to then prepare to act, and then share at the end. And so that's the structure which I'm going to discuss. Under commitment, obviously, you've got to understand what the problem is, align values, commit to action, and then start to understand the metrics that we've got to use to discuss the issue. Then within our practice, even though we've been working for 40 years with these issues, we still have to communicate and upskill our own people internally, and provide tools for which people can respond to what now the public are demanding. We've then, in the design process, got to do it. And at the end, we've got to share success, we've got to share the failures and lobby for change. So as Roger's kindly introduced us, the practice has been now going for over 40 years. And right from the outset, it's had a commitment to social values and sustainability. And we've been quite successful. And there's quite a strong timeline from the outset of the practice that can demonstrate this concern. Starting off, I'm sorry, this is a bit jittery, but right from the outset, when the main interests of Peter Clegg in particular was passive solar design, how could we use the power of the sun to help reduce the actual artificial power that we consume? 10 years in, then we started to understand with more sophistication how building services could respond to that. And then at the turn of the century, we were doing strong work, but in terms of communicating with clients, we found tools like One Planet Living that Roger's just mentioned as a useful way to help discuss the issues with clients. And now over the last 10 years, working in much more detail to get to passive house type standards so that the actual energy consumption in buildings is controlled. And now there's the really important issue of embodied carbon, which has now come in really within just the last 2 years in terms of main discussion. So firstly, how to commit. So within the practice, this has been very important for us because it's been a reintroduction of these issues and really trying to understand the awareness of what the emergency is. So this is the first Architects Declare Declaration item. I won't go through this, but just to say that we need to understand and articulate the problem. And simply in terms of global annual carbon emissions, I think 95% probably of society now understands the need to reduce our carbon emissions. And there's the desire to get to net zero internationally by 2050. And interestingly, in many local political situations, there's a much closer date of 2030 now being discussed and as an ambition. The other side is just how much of the world's resources we can consume, are available to consume. And this graph shows that up to 2016, which is the timing of this graph, we're needing 1.6 worlds to provide us with the ecological area and the resources to survive, to support our overall global consumption. And this varies by regional. And in the UK, which is our main target of our work, we need 3 planets worth of resources to survive the lifestyle that we enjoy. And within that 3 planets of resources, analysis shows how you can split that by energy use, transport, food, goods, services, infrastructure, and government provision. So this starts to give people a really clear understanding. And I think that is where One Planet Living is so powerful, because it's saying you can't live like this. This is 3 times worse than we can sustain. So we have to live within the ability of our planet. There are a few other significant changes. Electricity is being decarbonised. The growth of renewables in the UK, in particular wind farms, means that we are now just at the point where the carbon intensity of electricity has reduced to match gas, and it's continually falling to get to a point where if we really should be using electricity now, not gas, for all future building projects. The other knock-on effect of that is that with that issue, the decarbonising of the grid, alongside better design to reduce energy consumption, means that the embodied carbon of buildings in their initial construction and over their life cycle starts to be the really important issue that we now have to address. And so the red areas here, which is the amount of carbon released by the building construction materials and processes, which started off on the left-hand side under building regs and typical construction being less than a quarter of the impact over a 60-year period, is now rising to a half or more. So last year there were a number of events, and one of those was the big climate strike day on the 20th of September, and we used this as a way to cover issues within the practice. We all went down and joined the big march, and leading up to that, we got everyone in the practice to work out their own carbon footprint using the WWF calculator. A range of impacts, and it varied slightly on our offices, particularly because of transport impacts, which were higher in some areas than others. But there's a certain consistency here of the amount of carbon that we might consume through our home, our food, things we buy, and our travel. To then put that into context, we did this the first time in 2006, so 12 years later. Our impact per person hasn't gone down. It's the same as it was, but the practice has grown in size. But since 2016, it has gone back up. So we were reducing annually, but recently it's gone up. And part of that is that we're recording our flight data more accurately, but also carbon emissions from gas, particularly in cold weather, have been higher. So now that electricity is supplied in a greener way, we're starting to get some benefits again. But lots of the statements by the UK government about meeting climate change targets are only because of the decarbonisation of the electricity grid. It's not through us consuming less stuff. And that waste is another important thing. So the day before we had our climate strike, we emptied all the bins secretly to find out how well we're recycling in the London office. And we discovered all the things in brown were in the wrong place. So people aren't doing it very well. So we were putting stuff that you shouldn't recycle in the recycling and vice versa. But if we did it well, we were doing reasonably well at recycling. But this was a wake-up call to trying to do better. We also checked out our lunches. So we had a vegan chili that day with a carbon target per person that Dr. Jack Williams worked out of 0.44 kilograms of carbon equivalent. But the year before, we actually had a beef chili, con carne, which had a significantly higher impact. So this was just to make people realize that just changing your diet can have an enormous benefit on your carbon impact. And if we had vegan meals every day in the office, because we have a chef in each of our offices who provides our cooking, it would be enough to offset our train travel and paper usage in a year. So we're not yet vegan, we are vegetarian. We may actually go vegan. The other thing was then to compare the impact individually to the impact of our work. So if each person's individual impact in a year of their lifestyle is 1.6 tons. And the personal footprints of the office are 11.6, so 10 times bigger is the impact of running the office. The annual operational carbon of a HE building is obviously significantly bigger. And more frighteningly, the embodied carbon impact of that building that we're designing is enormous. And it's that embodied carbon that is immediate. And I'll come back to that issue when talking about the reuse of buildings. So having established what the problems are, or the potential problems, and acknowledging that there's an emergency, we have to prepare our tools. And there are 3 items within the AD declaration which are relevant. But in particular, in each stage of the design process, there are different things we can do. And this is our plan towards net zero carbon portfolio by 2030 against the RIBA work stages. So first of all, we've said that this year, every project is having an alternative zero carbon plan, and we've developed some tools to try and help calculate the outputs of each project. And also by the end of this year, every project will have a One Planet Living action plan, which I'll come back to. We're also collating information from our previous post-occupancy evaluations and data on buildings in use. And through that, informing what the target should be that we have to try and achieve, and having quite strong improvements of those targets every year up to 2025. We've then got to completely change and upskill how we detail buildings to make sure that we're following through on the carbon commitments. And we're having to make sure that through the construction process, we identify issues that we really want to put in the tender specifications for contractors so that they can perform information that they can help them monitor construction. And particularly for handover, make sure that there are processes there so that the building is built as it should be, as it was designed, and it can be operated in the way it was planned to be. So very simple operational information. And then we have to monitor these buildings. And really, we know we have to monitor buildings for at least 3 years in order to try to make sure that they are being used in the way that they were designed for, or if slight tweaks have to be made, we can help that so that they do perform as intended. And this is really why there's a real imperative to act now, every year, improving the target so that by 2025, every project that's starting on site is capable of being net zero in operation in 2030, because so many local authorities in the UK are saying they want to be carbon neutral by 2030. I don't think the industry is set up to deliver it. We've then got to use modeling. As I said, we've developed a model which we're hoping to outsource as freeware to the industry later this year to help establish early on carbon impacts for projects. And the problem isn't understood. You'll all be aware of the issue of carrier bags, which is the most environmentally appropriate bag. And it's complicated. And the organic cotton bag has the impact of 149 plastic bags. So it's fine if, in a way, it's fine if you use it, definitely save 150 plastic bags in use, but not if you just buy one and keep it and use it 10 times. And it's complicated. So there are a set of issues that will have to be looked at in embodied carbon through the life cycle. And the exhibition that we set up, which Roger visited and is now available online through our website, was looking at the impact of individual materials, and each of these samples that we showed and were visible through our shopfront window to passers by, each different sample in its extraction and manufacture to that point made 1 kilogram of CO2, and each of the totems in the exhibition was the volume of 1 kilogram of CO2. Post-occupancy evaluation is also critical. And if we're trying to get to 2030, If we're designing briefing a building now, which might open in 2024, and you perhaps do a short post-occupancy evaluation of 2 years, you've only got one more design cycle before you get to 2030. So post-occupancy evaluations are really important, and there are different scales of that should be done at different stages of a project. We need to understand how buildings are working in use by surveying the users, finding out what has worked, what hasn't worked, alongside working out if the actual energy performance is meeting the design targets, and then benchmarking those targets of the building that you're studying against the industry to make sure that we're getting year-on-year improvements. And then there's a whole set of the wider issues. One Planet Living's already been mentioned, and we could come back to that in discussion, but it's a simple methodology to look at the holistic issues: health and happiness, equity, local economy, culture and community, land and nature, sustainable water, food, transport, materials, waste, and energy. And it's not saying what you have to do, but it's helping that discussion, and you can map these issues against the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. There's guidance from LETI and other protocols, which will be discussed shortly. And this is all really useful information that has to be looked at. And then we've got to act, and so we have to go through the design process to actually deliver on what we're saying we're promising. Upgrading buildings then is important, and our recent work at the South Bank Centre, where we've renovated the 1960s brutalist buildings, concrete buildings of the Queen Elizabeth Hall and the Hayward Gallery, have shown that we've been able to halve the electricity consumption of the galleries and overall get about a 33% reduction, including better use in the performance spaces. Similarly, in Alexander Palace in London, where we've renovated the east wing of the building for performance space. And even on small projects where we should always look at whether we can reuse existing buildings to give exemplary performance in use without all the carbon involved in a structure. The overall design principles then have to be wide, and projects like our Hive library at Worcester looked at the biodiversity of the wetlands, which could theoretically flood on occasion, alongside really important monitoring of the energy consumption. And the circular economy is really important, so that if we are using materials at the outset, we really think through the life cycle, think about how they're replaced at the end or even reused, and try to use more timber in construction, which sequesters carbon. And in that, in particular, I'll run through that holistic view, so that materials alongside all the other principles are studied in detail. On the materials then, in particular, I'll just touch on timber. The use of cross-laminated timber is becoming more frequent, and there's very good examples now of using timber in buildings, even to reduce cost in construction, as at this building, which was designed in concrete, and then the contractor chose to go to timber. It's a 4-story. It was the largest CLT structure in the country at the time, a few years ago. And now there's big debates about fire protection in timber. So we mustn't let worries over fire, sort of emotional worries, stop the use of timber in construction. And timber can really help the feel of a building, that emotional response to a building, alongside reducing its carbon impact, taking account of all materials. So this building, for example, used stone, which was dug up 10 miles from the site. And then to try to get to overall net carbon buildings. So this building, which is student residences in Cambridge, looks at the moment, it's just got a 100-year design life, and it's carbon negative through the construction in the first 10 years. Sorry, I'll go back one. And we're looking at whether we can upgrade this even further. And this is through using a CLT frame which offsets the other building materials in its construction. The Woodland Trust was another exemplar project using CLT, which also developed the similar thinking. So we have to collaborate, and there are now really good tools to make sure that design teams use prefabricated elements and technologies to reduce carbon impacts. And we've got to learn from previous projects. So, for example, this is a set of our schools where classrooms, which are the red elements, often end up reusing ideas and components from previous projects. And through the use of BIM, there's now enormous potential to integrate construction detailing into early stage thinking. So lastly, then, we have to share the knowledge in projects. And there are two Architects Declare issues there, sharing knowledge and advocating faster change. And just one example on knowledge sharing, we're involved in some CIBSE research on school design. And one of our schools was within a set of 12 schools that were studied with different systems. And the first 4 schools in this set, which are all green on this table, all had cross-flow ventilation, thermal mass, narrow room depth, and taller room heights. And compared to the other design criteria, these 4 issues seem to offer the best control against future problems if there's climate change, so with rising temperatures. So here's a school with really good daylighting and a very simple system. Lo and behold, it's opening windows and having different ways that you can open them in different conditions and times of the day. Simply understood, providing cross ventilation and good performance. So we need to be very passive in our means, first of all, before getting very complicated. And lastly, then, there's the advocacy for change. And so if we have this knowledge about how buildings have performed in the past and how we want them to perform, we've got to share it. And there's extremely good work being carried out in the UK through the Committee on Climate Change, the UK Green Building Council, the EDGE, which is a think tank, and these new organisations, ACAN and LETI, which James will discuss in his presentation. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. It was great. I think first of all, I have another hello from Bath. Somebody I know from Hong Kong. She just texted and say, oh, just accidentally, incidentally, she's actually in Bath, so hello from her. It's a great presentation. I thought the graphic was great, and I think I've also have some. Sorry, I keep looking because people buzzing me. Oh, can we share the presentation? Yeah, the presentation, very kindly, both Ian and James have agreed to share the presentation because there's a lot of information in there and at the end. So afterwards we will do that. And I have a few more questions here, but I don't want to go through it now, but we'll save the questions until the end. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, James Woodall, Sustainability Manager from Allies and Morrison, another well-known UK practice, architectural practice. In the practice, there are kind of ongoing commitment to both the things that we talked about, Architects Declare, as well as our RIBA 2030 challenge. It is in the core of what they do. But what's also interesting was the LETI. We heard Ian mentioned it a few times, which stands for London Energy Transformation Initiative, which I find very interesting because it is what is called a bottom-up approach, insofar as it's not government policy, it's not government incentive, and it's not what I call what I call the kind of honor badge kind of system, say what achieving a certain level. Actually, I don't even want to say it's a bottom-up, it's almost a sideways approach, whereby, like James is led by a group of young generation of consultants working in the environmental design area, say, well, what can we do? And what are the real issues and how we move forward in delivering sustainability? So this is why I would like to hand the mic over to James to tell us a little bit more about what you do and what LETI really does and what it means and so on and so forth. So thank you very much, James, and the screen is all yours.
Okay. So you should now see my screen. So yeah, as Roger mentioned, I'm going to come at this and present from two different perspectives on the topic. So first and foremost, I'm going to talk from an advocacy standpoint and my involvement in LETI, which are the London Energy Transformation Initiative. And then I'm going to reflect on what LETI are doing from my day job, effectively as a practitioner, and introduce a few ways in which we look at LETI as an influence and a facilitation of what we can do, and the ways in which we reflect upon that and improve ourselves as well. So first off, my day job, this is my hat that I usually wear. I am Sustainability Manager at Allies and Morrison, who are an architecture and urban planning practice founded in 1984, so with an awful lot of experience behind us. And this slide just gives a bit of a snapshot as to where we work, how we work, and an awful lot of elements of the practice that have come together over the years. So 34 years old as a practice, 143 live projects at any given time. So an awful lot of influence in the market as well, through which we can start to think about sustainability at a broader level. But first, again, as I mentioned, I'm going to speak about an organization, LETI, and this is how I kind of describe them as a collaborative catalyst for change. So LETI are there to act as this catalyst for the industry, to act as this almost this form of peer review in the background, to sit behind and say, how are we doing things? Are we doing it quick enough? Based on the fact that we are in a climate emergency, is the industry acting fast enough? So I'm going to introduce a few key documents that LETI have released, especially over the last year, speak to those. First and foremost, I'm going to say, well, a lot of people ask, well, who are LETI? And LETI are best described as a network, really, of over 1,000 built environment professionals. And each member of LETI, each member of this network commits their time voluntarily. So it's not, they're not affiliated by an organization necessarily, but the beauty of LETI is in the diversity of the people that are involved in the network. So we're made up of developers, architects like myself, engineers, planners, academics, contractors, and everyone across the spectrum really of the built environment. They come together to make change, and we work in recognition of this thing here, the climate emergency. So this is almost act as the main stimulus for this group of people to come together and say, is the industry working hard enough, and how can we help facilitate this sustainable transition? So we're stimulating industry action by doing the things we do, which I'll touch on in a moment, ultimately in pursuit of a zero carbon future. Now we look at it from the UK standpoint, but what's most intriguing, especially in this presentation, is how some of the methods that LETI have used over the last year to influence change in the UK could be applied to different countries, different continents, perhaps, and look at it as a template for change. That's a really intriguing part. Ultimately, what we want to try and do is push our peers towards a more sustainable future. So with zero carbon in mind being the main emphasis here, how can we use our role and our influence that we have in working across the built environment to push our peers further, and the people we work with? I often feel that these four terms best sum up who we are as a network and how we work. So first off, we're a club of individuals. I mentioned before that we're not affiliated through our companies necessarily. Our companies support LETI and they recognize the benefits that it can bring in being associated with LETI, but we all dedicate our time on a voluntary basis to do the work we do. Secondary, we're participatory by nature. We offer anyone and everyone who can commit their time an ability to participate and contribute to the work that LETI do. So it's definitely not a club or perceived as such. It's very much an open arms network to say, if you want to contribute, come to us and we'll give you the opportunity to help and help further what you see as your commitment there. The third point is about being impartial, and this is the point that I'll reflect on a bit later as well. So we occupy almost a neutral territory in the built environment and in the market, because we don't have affiliation to a particular organization or a member entity or anything like that. So our work is entirely self-directed, And that can't be said of many organizations in the built environment. So I think that gives us this neutral ground, helps us gain unilateral support from different organizations and different people, because we are neutral. We don't have any biases necessarily at all. And the last point, we're provocative. We recognize that there's a very pressing need to push industry in a direction they may not feel comfortable with, based on the fact that, you know, things are good in an economic sense, or at least prior to the recent pandemic, things were very, very good. And we could say that we're a very productive and prosperous. We had a very prosperous economic state. And so we're here to come at a different angle and say, well, actually, if you look at the environmental state, we're not in a very good place, and we have to work to better ourselves. And so that's where LETI is urging more, and we're becoming provocative in that sense. So we do this work in a number of ways, and the images kind of give you a glimpse as to the kind of range of work that we do. So we hold regular engagement events where we go out to industry and ask for opinion. We hold a number of different roundtable events where, with smaller collectives of people on key topics that we'd like to explore in more depth. An example of that is embodied carbon. I know for a fact it's led to some of the deliverables we've talked about recently, and we've also released a number of key publications, especially over the last year, which I'm going to introduce. The final point, and really this is how LETI first came about, was working with the local authorities and government to inform policy decisions. And LETI's first deliverable that they first came out with was about getting to net zero and starting to formulate a proposition to the GLA, which is the Greater London Authority, about the measures through which they can influence the London Plan. And a number of those were successful and have actually been realised in the new London Plan. So, you know, building upon those roots, LETI have increased their influence over the market and their appetite to try and do more. Anyone with a keen eye can see that I'm always the person in these images that doesn't look at the camera. So, you know, that's my own personal point. This is an image that we find helps us to guide our work even further. So this path to net zero, or the journey to net zero, you see the flag at the end state in 2030, which Ian reflected upon about how we get to all buildings becoming net zero carbon in operation. That's for us the outcome, the goal that we want to set for ourselves as the built environment. And this basically underpins all of the work that LETI does. But we find it even more useful in some ways to track back from that goal and say, well, so when do buildings need to be designed to zero carbon? Because there's obviously a point through which buildings go through design process and then they become occupied, and they have to go through that bedding in period in order to operate at these levels that we intend them to be. So if we imagine 2025 is the point at which we want buildings to be designed to be zero carbon, that then sets us back on this backwards trajectory to say, well, actually, if we look at it on a year-by-year basis, in 2020 right now, 10% of all new buildings should be designed to zero carbon. And we can safely say that we're not at that point right now. So there's an awful lot of work to be done to highlight these inadequacies in what's happening right now and push for more, push for change. To put it another way, the aim of LETI's more immediate work is to deliver on national climate change targets. And our objective of our more recent work is to communicate to industry how we get there. And the best way we can phrase it is to highlight what good looks like. Now that's a really important point, because a lot of this work can feel quite notional and representative in scale, and the way in which we communicate is very important, because we have to provide good examples. We have to show what good looks like, both from a kind of performance standpoint, but also show good case studies of where people have done things well, what's worked for them, what hasn't worked for them. So we're very much a network that shares good practice and helps to facilitate that transition. When we looked out across the market, one of the key things that we found was that the built environment is a very diverse place, and it's made up of a number of different stakeholders with different needs, and they communicate in different ways. So you can see we've picked out a couple of examples here. Obviously, there's designers, which myself and Ian can speak to. There are other consultants involved in this that see the fruition of buildings come to life. The contractors are obviously there. Clients, you know, we'd be nowhere without clients to get the buildings realized. And then you have policymakers and occupants as well. So how are we communicating to each of these stakeholders at a kind of cross level, so that everyone can engage with the content that's being produced to facilitate zero carbon. So it's not, not particularly biased towards a contractor or a designer. It has to speak to this entire spectrum of people involved. And that's what led us to this first deliverable in late 2019. This is our operational zero carbon one-pager. And we took a very, very complex topic, and it still is a complex topic, net zero carbon. There's an awful lot of rationale and rhetoric around what zero carbon actually is. And we've distilled it into 5 key categories that you can see along the circle here. So we've got low energy use, management and verification, reducing construction impacts. That's the embodied piece that I'll speak to a bit more on later on, that Ian reflected on. The low carbon energy supply, and ultimately what we're trying to satisfy is a zero carbon balance. But ultimately what underpins this entire zero carbon one-pager is the notion that a zero carbon building is first and foremost an energy efficient building. And that's the point 1 around low energy use. So how can a building exhibit very low energy use, and what are the things that need to get us there in order to do that? And what underpins that are some key performance targets that we set out there that are performance-based attributes. So we're not trying to set prescriptive checklists of people to do certain things along the way. These are very much performance-led attributes that a net zero carbon building should exhibit. Rather than say you have to meet X, Y, Z, these are very much saying that we're giving you the freedom as designers to go out and find ways in order to meet these types of targets as their performance-based attributes, and not from a prescriptive standpoint to say, what do you have there? And it's not being audited in any sense either. This is very much a self-declaration thing we want to see happening in the industry. So very much reinforcing that bottom-up notion. And I talked before about how LETI occupy the neutral ground in the industry. And in a lot of ways, I see the biggest success of the document being its endorsement from a number of key organizations across the industry. So you can see here that the UK GBC, the Better Buildings Partnership, who are a very big commercial advocacy organization with a lot of the key landowners in London especially, helped develop the zero carbon one-pager. And then it was developed with the support of everyone like the Good Homes Alliance, the RIBA, so industry organizations, and CIBSE as well. And you can see now in industry, we're starting to see how this support, this mutual support and understanding with these bodies are starting to come to fruition. You can see that the zero carbon one-pager has been highlighted in a new CIBSE webpage, highlighting the overlaps with their policy, and it's in the RIBA Sustainable Outcomes document as well. So you can start to see LETI is getting in with these organizations and starting to influence the work they're doing and pointing out, this is good practice. So we can start to see the return on the investment we're actually putting into the market here. And the second thing I'm going to talk about is the Climate Emergency Design Guide. So if you imagine that the one-pager I presented sets the targets for a zero carbon building, the design guide is ultimately how do we get there? It starts to pinpoint the various design measures that would enable us to deliver a zero carbon building. It also explains how we got to these targets. So it underlines the key methodology that we went through to how to design a building that meets these targets as well. If you imagine, to put it simply, that this is a building's operational zero carbon balance. So the building obviously has on the left-hand side a bunch of different energy demands. And these could be cooling, heating, the plug loads, so everything, the stuff that we plug in and use on a daily basis. Everything from hot water to lighting as well has to be balanced, and it has to reach this equilibrium with what is happening to generate renewable energy, be it through wind, solar, a variety of different means that can be specific to site. That balance, that equilibrium has to be satisfied at the building level. But how does that apply to the national level? And how do we bring those principles of zero carbon design to a broader scale, to look at what's happening to our grid? Our energy grid right now is decarbonizing and at a rapid rate as well. So how do we take that context into account and apply these zero carbon models, take them from a building centric standpoint and apply them to a national scale? Ultimately, that's what we're trying to do with the Climate Emergency Design Guide. We're trying to take the principles and expand them to a much broader level to make them UK centric. So they're not just being on a site-by-site basis. It's like saying that if you build a building to the Climate Emergency Design Guide levels, you're contributing to a zero carbon future across the scale of the UK, rather than simply saying that our building is zero carbon. So it's how can you do more to facilitate it for the entire built environment. And this page here sets out what the chapters are in that guide. So we split it into 5 key chapters. We have operation energy, embodied carbon, which took on a form of its own because of the amount of things actually associated with embodied carbon. So there's an entirely separate guide that kind of spawned itself from this, which I'll talk about a bit. There is the future of heat, demand response, and data disclosure, which data disclosure, I can't underline how important that point is. It's about how you actually deliver and operate a zero carbon building after you've designed it. So how does it meet the intent? We have a number of different archetypes in the climate emergency design guide. So we took 4 key building types that together represented 75% of new buildings likely to be built between now and 2050. And we basically created those as archetypes to set key performance criteria against those building types. And you can see in the example, you've got medium and large scale housing. We also have small scale housing, schools as well, and offices, sorry. And the key performance indicators look like this. So we have an energy use intensity target, which has been informed through 2 different types of modeling exercises that I'll talk about in a moment. We have space heat demand targets, which are aligned with the Passive House standard for those familiar with it, and the renewable energy generation targets as well. 3 really kind of basic criteria that set out, this is what good looks like. This is what we think you need to get to in order to facilitate that transition to a zero carbon future across the UK. And how we did that is the most kind of fascinating part, to me at least. The methodology, so we took two ways of doing this. We looked at it from a top-down perspective. So we looked at what's happening to the grid. And we said, okay, the grid is decarbonizing, and we obviously have projections from government about how far it's going. But what we want to try and do is forecast that renewable energy output and ultimately try and apply a carbon budget that's appropriate to each individual building type based on its proportion of the industry, to say that each building type should have an energy demand of X based on the amount of renewable energy there to support that. So that's the top-down approach in looking at it from government-led renewable energy targets and seeing what's the budget available for each building type there. And then we have the bottom-up. So we did a lot of modeling in the background for these key archetypes to say what's appropriate in terms of looking at it from a building by building standpoint. What energy efficiency options are available? What's the most cost-effective methods as well? And then see how far we could actually get. If we were to push this building, how far can we get in order to achieve that low energy design that we've highlighted there? And it's a balance of the bottom up and the top down approaches that we're able to say that we've reached this common ground over where we consider zero carbon buildings performance in terms of demand to actually be. So that's how we derive the targets themselves under the climate emergency design guide there. That's the bottom up effectively approach that we're taking. The second deliverable that came out at the same time, I mentioned that embodied carbon took on a form of its own, and that's basically a reflection of the fact that the industry is really still coming to grips with the scale of the challenge for embodied carbon. So because of that notion, we felt it appropriate to actually create an accompanying deliverable for embodied carbon, and we call it the embodied carbon primer, because we can't claim to know everything about embodied carbon. So this is effectively an accumulation of all the knowledge that's been gathered to date on embodied carbon that's right now in a number of different places, bringing that all together and putting it in one consolidated document for the industry to use as a reference guide. And we definitely don't see this as the kind of culmination. We see this as definitely a step towards what can be a kind of, a better guide for people to use to communicate and deliver on embodied carbon in the future. That guide prompted us to really consider how the work we're doing fed a wider notion of what whole life carbon really actually was. So we've talked about operational zero carbon, we talked about embodied carbon. The endpoint for us, for LETI as an organization, is really whole life carbon. And that's a blend of achieving net zero operational carbon, but also reducing the embodied carbon as much as you can on site and looking at how it feeds a wider circular economy. The whole life carbon is really a culmination of the two together. It's a composite of the two together. And so what the guide helped us to do is actually look at our chapters in unison and consider actually they're doing one thing, that they're serving what we're trying to reach as an end goal, which is whole life carbon. The embodied carbon primer, I know Ian showed this graphic again, But what we've done is broken it down by building type. So here you can see the medium scale residential, and it does highlight the need to emphasize how important embodied carbon is. So at the moment, the pie chart on the left-hand side highlights what a typical building looks like when designed to our UK building regulations. And you can see that the operational carbon, the orange piece of the pie, actually forms a vast portion of that. That's why our industry has focused so heavily on operational carbon to date. But if we reduce that building's overall consumption down to the levels we're speaking about in the emergency design guide, the embodied carbon quickly takes on the vast proportion of that use. So it quickly becomes the predominant thing that we have to try and address in the future. That's behind why we have to press so much on this. And we've also broken that predominant use type down. So if embodied carbon is made up of different types and different material types that come to site and different elements that form the building, can we create these kind of representative scales to say, well, you know, if the structure is so heavy, how much is it? And this is a really useful thing for us to use in practice, especially because it gives us that grounding to say, you know, what do I have the most control over and what do I have less control over? And I have to, you know, encourage others to take better account of. So these are really, really important things to put a lot of light to things that we knew about were happening in the background, but we didn't have the data to hand in order to take full action on this. And the culmination is really these whole life carbon targets that LETI have produced in the guide, which set out over a trajectory. So business as usual, you've got that on the left-hand side here. And then we've set targets for 2020, 2030, ultimately trying to get down to this whole life net zero target at the end on the right-hand side. So we're seeing this very much as a trajectory, not saying that the design guide targets are there to be met day one. Definitely it is going to be something of a gradual improvement that the industry has to take in order to get there. And this is just a quick shot from the launch. So when we produced these documents, we knew that we were trying to serve a gap in the industry. We knew that there was an appetite for this type of data to help stimulate zero carbon future. But the launch event in London was where we really realized how much industry appreciated what we'd done. And it was a packed out event at the Building Centre in London. It's been really amazing to witness the amount of support that we've had across the industry for the work that LETI have been able to do. And it's almost highlighted the importance of the work moving forward. So we're quickly taking on new work streams into 2020 and thinking about what the next things are that we need to address and help, you know, drive that knowledge further. So moving away from LETI and talking about it from a practitioner standpoint, I just want to kind of focus on what practices can really do, thinking about it from a practitioner standpoint and from a design-centric standpoint. The advocacy is there now, the data is there for us to do it. So with all this in mind and noting that 2019 was really that kind of, that year of change, if you like. This was really the year of conviction, 2019, when a lot of practices signed up to the 2030 challenge that RIBA brought out. Architects Declare has set the scene for you know, what is whole scale change to happen in the industry. So how do practices actually take that on board and think about it, you know, in terms of implementation? To put it one way, we imagine the status quo for many is like this. So over time, the line is effectively projects coming and going. So you might have one project every 5 years, say, that has an opportunity to showcase some sustainable initiatives. That might be because you've got an ambitious client, for example. But for that client, there's probably going to be another 5 projects or so that do just enough, right? They pass regulations, they get by, and they're not doing anything particularly innovative at all. And overall, if you look at it one way, the kind of cumulative impact of this work may do very little to deliver that sustainable future that we're seeking here. The way in which we're trying to view this is different, and we want to see it as a trajectory over time and the impact gradually grow with what we're doing. So we see this, we see every project right now from Allies and Morrison standpoint as an opportunity to increase our impact, but also to learn from. So what we see happening is a gradual increase in our proficiency to design to these types of levels of performance. We're not necessarily equipped to deal with these things right now, and it does take a lot of time in order to build the knowledge and understand what's happening in different projects in order to, you know, to get to these levels that we're seeking by 2030. And it's really important to say that, you know, it's not net zero carbon or bust. So if we have a project that we set a very aspirational target at the beginning for zero carbon, and a client for one reason or another can't get there, don't look at it and say, well, we'll go back to default. We'll go back to building regulations right now. See it as an opportunity to think what you can do and what you can learn from. You know, what are the gains that you can make from that project without just defaulting back to what is status quo? What can be learned? And the consistency is really the key here. We recognize the different aspects of influence as an organization. So we see it in three kind of key themes or aspects. The first one is obviously the largest with the projects. So being practitioners, we have an awful lot of responsibility to design projects that are low carbon and that help obviously facilitate this transition to a sustainable future. But it's also important to recognize that there are people that work in our organization. So we are an employer as well. We have to reference the fact that we're an employer, and we have a duty to provide the right resources to the people we employ. And thirdly, we're a practice. So we're an organization. We are an entity that consumes. So if we think about it that way, we have an office. We might not be there at the moment, but we have an office that consumes energy on a daily basis. So think about it in these three terms, but also to recognize there are interdependencies that exist between these three aspects. So for example, the way in which we communicate sustainability as a practice to the industry, that resonates to our staff, right? And each member of staff will take that on board and say, okay, Allies and Morrison, you know, we really focus on sustainable design. That sustainable design intent can then be harnessed across much more of our projects if the staff understand more about what it is and what it means to us as an organization. So it's very much a kind of cascading influence that we see happening through our work and through these different aspects. We felt the need to reflect upon each individually, but recognize those linkages that happen there. This is just a quick summary of where we see our work going. So to set out our ambition in the future, we're just about to release our sustainability strategy for a time period of 2020 to 2025. And we've set it into kind of three key objectives that we're setting out. So we want to try and do more around net zero project performance. So what's going to facilitate that shift to designing more projects to net zero? We want to do more to become a carbon neutral organization. So we want to be able to find out what's going to facilitate that shift in a 5-year period. And we want to be able to do more around post-occupancy evaluation. So how can we incorporate post-occupancy evaluation into all of our projects in the future? So what are the enabling things that happen? Ian spoke to this notion of prepare, and we very much see what's happening right now is setting up those enabling works effectively to facilitate these things to happen on a much more consistent basis. I'm going to set out three things or three terms, aspects where we see the greatest change is really going to come from in that 5-year period that we've set ourselves. So the first one is really just to make stage one count. So when we're first getting onto a project and we're speaking to a client and we're formulating what is a brief, how do we set clear outcomes that are executable from that conception point to embed into that client brief? That's the point at which you're setting out that project's ambition for the best part of 5 years onwards in some cases. So it's really, really important to get stage one down and have those conversations with an air of conviction, because it's very hard to post-rationalize a requirement that is almost a heightening of ambition once you've already begun a project. A good example of that is in retrofit of existing buildings, and these are really good examples that I've set out from Allies and Morrison's standpoint. The left-hand side is Westworks, an existing office building in White City in London, which we took, which had an ambition to simply adhere to the status quo, which was to demolish that building and then rebuild something. We felt it was worthwhile, definitely worthwhile, retaining what was there and adding in elements that could almost enhance its usability. So we stripped it back to its facade and to its internals. We replaced a lot of the facade elements that were weaker performing, and we started to reimagine what this building could actually become. So not look upon an existing building as a weakness, but as an asset that we could actually build upon and improve upon. Now, from an environmental standpoint, that makes perfect sense because we're keeping the carbon in that building. We're not demolishing. We're not seeing it as an obsolete asset. We're seeing it as something that has material value that we can then invest more in. And the right-hand side is the Crane building in Southwark, really close to our office, where we took a bit more of an approach where we stripped back to the core and the structure of that building. So we took more off in this case, but we felt that the structure was definitely an asset that we wanted to retain, and it stopped us having to go into the ground and build more foundations out, which I showed earlier, the vast majority of most buildings embody carbon. So in thinking about it more strategically, we can actually retain carbon without having to put pen to paper on most occasions. The second point is about modeling early and often.
There's some audio issue, sorry.
Hello?
Yeah.
I'm back? Okay.
Yes, you're back.
Okay. So I'm on the last two slides, so hopefully it won't cut out again. Okay. All right, so this is just highlighting what we see as our sustainability toolkit. So in implementing a lot of the standards and requirements and performance attributes I've talked about, there's a need to create a process to govern this activity and provide a vehicle to incorporate this into our work. And this is our sustainability toolkit, which creates a framework of different tasks along a project timeline through which we can actually do that. So it's creating just suggestions through which you can say, what can be done at this point in time? What's the optimal point to carry out this type of analysis? And how can you bring it into your work from that point? So we're setting out some almost key checkpoints along the design timeline through which staff can really think about it on a more expansive way. And we're also trying to upskill our staff to carry out environmental analysis. And this is part of a wider learning and development program we've got in-house. So we're starting to see ways in which we can help our design staff increase their understanding of design. And it really offers really valuable insights at the outset of a design process. If we can see, the influence that the microclimate has on a particular building type or a master plan, and you can create design solutions built upon those insights as well. The final point I wanted to make was about embedding feedback loops. So this is applicable on an internal basis, so thinking about our process as an organization, but also from an industry-wide standpoint. How can we share more information between practices? Because collective growth is ultimately what we're after. So understanding what goes well and what doesn't go well is really at the point at which we begin to learn and we begin to make progress. So thinking about it from a post-occupancy standpoint, we want to help, we want to learn more about how people inhabit our buildings and they work within our buildings. And from those experiences and those interactions, we can really begin to formulate an idea of how a built environment can best create a sustainable future that is one for people as well. Because things that could often be left out of these presentations are the people, and it's really important to focus on how people are responding to these things we're designing and building over time. So I'll leave my presentation there, and I'll hand it back over to you, Roger.
Making some notes, and I've seen you making some notes as well through. And I just want to say a few things before I go to my studio guest. Is that lots of information. The graphic is great. I think it's certainly explained a lot of the very complex issues in a very simple way. But still, there's still a lot of information. And I must say, I have an apologies to my speakers. I've given them an impossible task to explain something so complex in such a short time. But you've done marvelously, and I've already really got people texting me, can we share the presentation? And I said, yes, they will be shared. And also, this is being broadcast live, both in Zoom as well as in Facebook. You can, tonight when you go home, you can rerun it many, many times if you so wish, that is, through our Facebook post, if you didn't catch anything. And I think the important thing for me is to generate a conversation, because as I was listening to the presentation, the thing that I keep thinking, wow, these are great. I mean, in a way, I was hoping that somewhere somebody will text me and say, oh, this is what we're doing in Hong Kong as well. Oh, this is what we're doing in Quill. And then that could potentially generate a very helpful kind of conversation. And if it is something that it's somebody that hear it, or from somebody, hello, Chris, Professor Ryan, or if something that's being done in Melbourne, share, the idea, I like the word you use, sharing. I think let's go beyond communications. Let's go sharing. Ian mentioned the open source. I'm looking forward to that open source thing that you'll be sharing with everybody. And obviously, LETI, through the work that you do, you're sharing with other people and influencing the government and also clients. I think this is a big word. I mean, also Ian also talked about communicating with a client. And I think, picking one small point, you in your presentation, you mentioned the future of heating. So in Hong Kong, it would be the future of cooling to some extent. So that kind of conversation will be very, very good. I hope through these sessions we will generate that. And the last thing I want to say before I ask the guests some question is, To paraphrase a famous line in a movie, for me, the holy grail of sustainability is not to talk about sustainability. In a sense that, because we talk about it, because we're not doing enough. But if we're doing it enough, we don't have to talk about it anymore. So anyway, so to my guests, I'll start with Winnie. A lot of really good food for thought. Talking of food, so how are you going to tell when you go to dinner? How are you going to, question comes up, so how was your webinar? What did you learn?
To who?
Well, I mean, or somebody, exactly. Well, whoever your data is.
It's very interesting because I'm especially drawn to James sharing about what LETI's been doing. I think in Hong Kong there are different professionals or non-professionals who simply having keen interests on waste management, sustainability, carbon reduction. I think gradually you can see the civil society having a lot of interesting development. People from the same industry, people from across industry, they start together. I think one very interesting observation is, I think around the world, quite a bit of us actually witness, if I may say, the failure of the market, or even the failure of the government in parts of the world. And then a lot of us have this enlightenment, thinking that the civil society can actually do much more. We do have a lot of resources with us. We have the expertise. We have financial resources, some of us, including the foundation. And I guess now it is a challenge of how are we going to organize all these resources towards a common goal and on the same path. I think what LETI is doing is exactly presenting a workable, feasible action model, how individuals can come forward and act collectively on this very important carbon reduction mission. And I'm very much impressed by that. But my question on that particular point would be, now that it's sort of the communication or the sharing is among a group of vested interest stakeholders like developers, the client, and so on, how can you actually scale up the impact to influence or to engage and involve those people outside these circles? Do you have any plans or what's the next steps? I'd be very keen to know more about that.
Okay, so in terms of next steps for LETI, I think we've always kind of used industry as a bit of a sounding board in essence. So we've identified from the beginning of LETI, we've identified where gaps might be that we want to try and fill to help stimulate knowledge and stimulate discussion. And I think what we're trying to do now is become more of a receptor at the same time. So to involve particular stakeholders who weren't too much of a presence in what we were doing prior to this. So giving those people an opportunity to contribute and almost feed into this broader process and give us feedback and say what works well for you, what is difficult to understand. And I think it's a really, really pressing point. I don't think we can say we've done it enough about occupants and people that inhabit buildings necessarily. So absolutely, that's one area that we definitely need to press upon, and it's finding those groups of people that best represent those stakeholder types. So how do we link in with those organizations and those types of people that we feel become the best voices for that? But it's a very, very diverse group of people. So we might have to look at it by sector. But what we are doing is look at it and say, we're creating different industry forums whereby we can think about it and say, we have the emergency design guide there now. What we want to try and do is think about it more broadly and say, how can it serve your interests? How can we create different mediums of publications, be it deliverables, presentations, things like this that we can help get the points across to different people who speak in different ways. Yeah.
That's I think that's very, very interesting, and very much looking forward to have you share maybe in another sessions. But I guess it would be very challenging to do so, because if you're within the same industry or having some kind of same knowledge base, the gap, it's pretty easy to close.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about reaching out to the wider community, laymen or citizens, it's the gap is actually can be very, very wide. Tell you one example. So my team and I are recently in a job where we have to explain about Paris Agreement to the local community people. And we do have people actually telling us that they thought carbon reduction is about reducing carbohydrate in their diet. So you can get that kind of pool of citizens who genuinely do not have any background at all. But as you said, they are the occupants of a flat or a housing, and they every day, the diet, what they consume, the turning on television or shower, the time that they take for the shower, all counts in the carbon reduction strategies. I think that will be very challenging for us to go beyond, the experts and keen, interested stakeholders and reach out to the community members.
Yeah, completely agree.
So it's interesting. I think it's a good lead in terms of, if you were to write an article in a magazine, so that is a general sort of magazine, it's one of those industry kind of trade paper. How would you kind of, that would be the challenge. How would you disseminate this sort of information?
Well, actually, I have a similar question that was to me as well, because I agree that it's really hard to actually interpret this kind of information and this interest into people, because general people, they all have been doing walks of life, so they have the different concerns of, so maybe somebody just wants a basic life, and then somebody wants to have have different kind of lifestyles. So I think the most important part is we have to find a really common, how do you say, a general thing that maybe it doesn't sound like about sustainability, but it has to be something that closer to their life. For example, in Hong Kong, it's really hard to it's really, actually it is, right? Really, I'm sure really agrees that it's really hard to tell people, or even to explain to people what sustainability is all about, because they don't care. They just don't care. We have a lot of things happenings. Maybe social, economic, or political issues are more important, way more important than environmental, the environmental part. How do we translate this kind of information to the general public? We have to twist the angle. Maybe, for example, I think that I have a lot of envy about the fact that a lot of people, a lot of professionals and experts have a common goal about having zero net carbon, but not many people have the same kind of interest. And I would twist it that way. Like, imagine you have to create a trend that attracts people, because in the fashion industry, it's really easy to make a trend that everyone follows it, right? So you have to get a feel-good factor that attracts people. For example, in Hong Kong, we have some hope in planting this kind of spirit in young people, because the hipster culture is actually very close to the values that we want to promote in terms of sustainability. So, and as for the users, I think, and of course it's really challenging, just how we can make it like you have to tell people or promote a lifestyle to people that actually is closer to our lifestyle. Because after all, it's the occupants or the users of the buildings that they have a large part in how we can achieve the zero carbon, right? So I think that's important, that how we can just translate or have some factors that are closer to the lifestyle. I remember in Stockholm, I think many years ago, I went to visit the eco housing or something, and people were, you actually did not have to educate people about recycling back then already, because they have it really convenient installed in their kitchen, and people find it really interesting. I talked to the residents of that building, also why why exactly you're moving into this village. It's not really about. It's not like they really care about the environment or whatever. But they just want the convenience, and they find it really comfortable to live there, and find it is cool to live there, and that's already an important factor
Yes.
to translate that spirit or to promote the spirit to people.
You see, there's something I've always thought was, well, actually, maybe it's another session called marketing sustainability, because in a way it is about branding. Because you hear about carbon reduction, waste reduction. So your reduction, I mean, already is a negative. It should be branded as something positive, something that lifestyle. Doing this enhances your lifestyle. So it's something plus. So therefore, you feel that you're gaining something rather than giving away part of your lifestyle. I think they've come at it completely wrong angle to sort of reduction, add to your value of your life. I think that somewhere, if there is a marketeer listening to this, I mean, that's maybe that's a kind of a good way to look at that. Now, actually, I like to. There are a couple of good questions that's come through, and I like the perhaps Ian could answer the first one. It's from a student, funny enough. It says, how can students incorporate sustainable design measures in their projects? I think that's a good question. In a way, it's almost impossible to answer to some extent, but I'd like to hear your views on it.
Okay, well, I think it's a very sad question. Because basically, the issues that we have to address are what architecture should be doing. So I think it's a bit like the lifestyle issue. I mean, there's a big emergency here, and if an architecture student is asking how do they incorporate sustainability issues in their design, first off, they should demand from their course tutors that they're taught it in very as a almost the top issue that has to be addressed within an architecture course. They should seek out parallel construction courses and say that they'd like to have joint design courses with engineers and other professions. I mean, it's what design is. It shouldn't be an add-on. And there are courses now offering this sort of collaborative holistic teaching, which I think will have to increase in number in a very short timescale. Could I just offer one other comment on the last comment about lifestyle, because basically that is the problem. It's a lifestyle problem, and there's no point us designing zero carbon homes if someone's lifestyle has 3 cars, 5 foreign holidays a year, and eats beef every dinner. So I think it's a lifestyle issue, and we're just been discussing one little bit of it, and architecture has to address the whole thing, or has opportunity to address and support the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, anything to add, James?
I mean, just from a broader sort of standpoint, where on reflection of what's been talked about, I feel that in terms of what's missing, there seems to be a gap in accountability. So, what's governing people's lifestyle choices tends to be from an economic standpoint. Now, we all know what governs economic prosperity at the moment is GDP. Now, GDP isn't linked in any way, shape or form to sustainable growth. There are new models which try and communicate economic growth through a more sustainable lens, like the donut economics model, which I found particularly intriguing. It tries to link it through what they call planetary boundaries to see, what aspects of a particular economy, be it a global economy or a city's economy, is actually exceeding those boundaries, and gives them an idea of, where should we be trying to focus our efforts more, and what is that healthy part of which we consider ourselves more sustainable. It's within the realm of that donut. It's a really, really fascinating model that has a graphic to go with it, which is really accessible at the same time. So I think we have to go back to our core and say, if people's lifestyles are not sustainable, we have to look at the system. We have to look at how people are being made accountable to it. And I think it's part carrot, part stick. There has to be something which is, marketing to people to encourage, but at the same time, there has to be something from above trying to govern what creates a sustainable lifestyle at the outset.
I've got a few very interesting questions, so if you don't mind, I'll read them out. But James, while you want it, it's a direct for you. It's a very simple question. James, is LETI a non-profit organization? Where comes the financial support? Are the professional volunteers to the LETI project? Now, the last one is from me. How can you control 100 people, 1,000 people input? That for me was amazing. So that last bit was from me.
Okay, I'll address the first one because it's very easy. LETI is not for profit, but we're not even registered as a non-profit. We are basically a network of people that come together, that volunteer time outside of their work hours. So we come together and we say, what are the issues we need to solve? And we identify what the work streams they are to try and solve it. And then we split into different groups on an annual basis to say, let's tackle big things right now. One of the biggest work streams we have right now is retrofit. And there's a group of probably, I know from, in terms of what my involvement is, there's probably about 10 or 15 people that are at the core of that group. And then there are a network of additional people that have registered interest from the industry, from the broader industry, which could make up anywhere from 10 to 100, just come together. And the core group tries to set the direction of that work. And they basically encourage people to commit their time to help produce effectively what the work is, and they lend their time, their participation, and their knowledge to that as well. Because people are bringing in knowledge from all sorts of different backgrounds, and we're really benefiting from it.
This is great. I mean, I think so sorry if I have to ask, but it's right that there is no such thing as a Mr. LETI or Mrs. LETI that sits at the top.
Not officially. No, not officially. I mean, LETI was founded by someone who is a really particularly strong advocate, but she doesn't really like to be identified as such. She doesn't like the spotlight. So it's really kind of gratifying that Clara really takes on that scope, and she tends to push the kind of plaudits onto the rest of the group. So it is very much. There's not a particular Mr. LETI. If you ask LETI to bring your presentation or to present at an event, it could be any one of 100 people doing that presentation. Because we all share the common goal.
So we're very grateful that you've done that for us today, and it's actually a real true manifestation. Sorry, I don't have the English translation. True manifestation of 冇大台, right? Yeah. It's a very common phrase we are using these days for different reasons. So Ian, I have a couple of questions from the floor for you. I think the second one is easier. I'll read out the second one first. Ian, everyone eats. Is being vegetarian and vegan a very effective way to combat global warming?
Yes, in short. Vegan more so than vegetarian. So much land is used for high intensity livestock farming. Not only are forests being cut down for that in the same way as for palm sugar, but also just the amount of calories that go into making a calorie of beef are staggering. So it's very inefficient. It might be tasty, but it's having an enormous impact. So yes, going vegan has a dramatic reduction on your individual carbon impact. And
another question, COVID-19, a good wake-up call to humanity. We only have very limited time to race with global warming, but looking at the pace of what we are doing, it is quite pessimistic towards this goal of zero carbon by 2030. Now, how do you think we can really accomplish it in this short time? Actually, this relates to another question, which I'll read at the same time. I think it's a very similar question. There are many organizations and efforts working towards sustainability, but we are not making a dent in climate change globally. How can we do it better? I think that the question is, how long is a piece? How many hours can we spend here talking about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a serious. We're in a serious predicament, and I think trying to get net zero carbon buildings is one little piece in that whole jigsaw. I know that there are comments suggesting that construction in the UK contributes 40% of carbon emissions, but that's not correct. It's 40% of man-made carbon emissions. And so there's a whole set of issues that we have to address. Energy-related emissions, 40% of energy-related emissions. So it excludes all the impacts of food and other issues. So I think it's got to be much more joined up, and I think it does have to be a change of the system, as James was suggesting, like Kate Raworth's book and others on having a different way of judging success within the world economy, I think. And just one last thing, in some ways, just a comment on the One Planet Living initiative. It's interesting that health and happiness has moved to the top one of those items in the discussions with community groups, and it really relates to the comment made earlier about what lifestyle. How can we sell this to people? And actually, it's got to be seen as something that's better. It's got to be seen as something that's better individually, but more importantly for the community. And unfortunately, in the UK, the politics of the 1980s made respect for community and society less important than personal gain. And so we've got to see a way that society actually just genuinely values society and value the world. And that's got to be seen as something that people want for us to get anywhere near the changes that are needed. So I just think that having a 2030 target is much better than having a 2050 target. Because if we only say we're going to get there by 2050, well, it'll be much too late. So we've genuinely got to work on all fronts to achieve things in this decade, or else it'll be a disaster.
James,
Can I add a point?
Yeah.
Just to reflect on that again, I think it's really, really important that the same principles that Ian shared in his presentation, this notion of act, prepare, sorry, I forget what the others are, but we really require that.
Commit, act, prepare, share.
Commit, act, prepare, and share. We need that. We need that not only at a voluntary level. So we're thinking about it from a practice perspective about how we as individuals can do more, but we also require the same emphasis from our governments. And so one of the things that I didn't share about what LETI did was we were advocating for much stronger change in our building regulations, because we're actually under consultation right now for Part L of our regulations. And we were finding that the changes that have been proposed to industry were far too lax. They weren't on the same trajectory as what was actually required to meet what the UK has legislated for in terms of a zero carbon future. So we're seeing inadequacies across government right now about setting out what is an ambitious target, but not actually subscribing to that when it comes to things like regulation. So to put it another way, LETI, the way I like to see it is that groups like LETI and practices like ourselves, we help to heighten the ceiling of what is possible. But ultimately, that's a voluntary commitment we're making to do those types of things. We also rely on the floor to be raised for the rest of those people to actually improve the kind of bottom-up approach. Really relies on government to set that foundation for everyone to subscribe to actually become an awful lot higher than it actually is right now. So the ceiling should grow, and the ceiling will grow higher, but we also require the floor to grow with it.
Fantastic. On that note, I think we have a slight advantage in that our Secretary for Environment is an architect. So I think we've got, now I think we've got enough people who are listening to this who are also architects, who also could, rally together and make sure our Secretary for Environment has got a sight of this conversation. And I'm sure, we'll see. But anything you want to add on that, really big question at the end?
Well, hopefully, I'd say everybody counts. I think in this journey of achieving sustainability or towards zero carbon, I was several years ago at the sharing, and someone who I consider a very wise person were asked one question, what can anybody do? One thing to make this zero carbon goal sort of moving forward. And that speakers actually gave a very, very good answer that I'd like to share with you all, is that we should sleep more.
Well, that's a great answer. I like that.
So that is something that we can all do. If you sleep more, you probably consume less. You probably use less electricity, assuming you're not in an air-conditioned sort of room. And you probably eat less, and you have a healthy life because you rest more. Then you get more energy to pursue the kind of work that you would like to pursue. I do think that is something very good, that everyone can take more rest and have a more relaxed lifestyle. That actually will later on bring forward all this zero carbon or sustainability lifestyle back to the mainstream of what we do.
Yeah.
So,
I just want to add that because like I said, actually this morning I was reading One Planet Living's toolkit this morning, and I was really there was two words that really struck me, which is live happily. And this one.
Well, that's a positive message, isn't it? Live happily.
And it is a pessimistic. It can be a pessimistic issue that we know that we are way too slow, but I think that to live happily is really like the answer to a lot of questions, because I think in Hong Kong there are a lot of people trying to promote green messages in Hong Kong already, but we have a common problem that we make it sound like we try to condemn people too much. Like we complain too much. We say, "Oh, you're doing it wrong too much." Yeah, and it's really common in Hong Kong.
And we should celebrate. People would feel right.
Yeah, we should celebrate, because something if it doesn't feel good, actually it won't stay. So we have to make sustainable lifestyle something that makes people feel good, so that people will follow and they want to do it. It's just like fashion trends. Yeah, that's what I think.
Very good. So I'm not going to keep you very much longer, because you've got your dates to go for dinner with, on a vegetarian dinner or vegan dinner, I'm sure, and go back home to sleep more, which is great, fantastic. Now, I have a couple more things to add. Now, well, first of all, a lot of people have asked me, as I said, you share everything. Also, I will ask our guests and Ian and James to share an email address, so that if anybody have any direct questions that can ask you, they can ask you directly, and so on. So that would be great. And a couple of things that I want to say, there is another question to say, well, how can, if they want to get involved with this sort of discussion, well, don't worry. In the coming weeks, there will be other discussions. Starting next week, we have a session on sustainability, specifically on mobility. The session will connect Milan, London, Hong Kong, and Shenzhen. So watch this space for that. And then on the next one, on the July the 16th, there will be a session on inclusion, diversity, and equality, which actually is very topical for various things happening around the world. Very topical session. We have a little bit of gap on the 23rd, not because we don't want to do anything, it's because we haven't decided whether it's about fashion or whether it's about food. So actually, it's very well that you mentioned it, because that's a very, very important aspect of sustainability. And then on the 30th of July I'm actually looking forward to all the sessions, but that one is our sustainability report, which we've actually engaged a sustainability consultant to look at the footprint of the Biennale itself. I've seen the first draft of this. Interesting reading, and there's going to be a bun fight about this exhibit. I'm more sustainable. So behind it, there are other things as well, like traveling, and like the session, like not just embedded carbon on the product itself or the exhibition itself, but also the energy used during the exhibition. Fantastic, and we'll have a workshop with the exhibitors before the report. So on the 30th, I'm really looking forward to that. And then and then there'll be others. So if you want to get engaged or in any of these sessions as either on stage or have something to say, get in touch with the Biennale. Our email, you can find us on Facebook, and you know, if you actually visit this session, you'll be able to have ways of getting in touch with us, and we would, you know, the idea. One of the things that's I'm very I hate to use the word grateful. I don't want to use the word grateful, but one thing that we actually took the opportunity to do is make these sessions a lot more, have a more sense of relevance. And that means we have to have a bit more agility in terms of organizing. You know, long gone are the days when we have to plan these sessions months in advance, send invitation out to make sure enough people coming. But actually, for all I care, for all I know, there might not be anybody sitting behind that screen, you know. But we've had a good conversation, and then we can share it and so on. But I've heard that there was a lot of people, you know, ranging from Australia, and I've just got a message from somebody who's you know, the consultant who helped us on the sustainability report. He's actually graduated from the University of Bath, so in a way, he's also connecting people together. Sorry, it's turning into a Bath University reunion. But anyway, so anything else to add before we close from all of you? A few final words. Ian, any final words?
Enjoy your dinner.
James?
Not from me, thank you, Roger.
Thank you. I hope to hear from you guys more.
Thank you.
Yeah, Roger, thank you for organizing this. It's been enjoyable.
This is
Thank you very
fantastic. We've had some very, very good feedback. So thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you very much to all our guests in the studio.
Nice meeting you.
Bye.
Okay, and you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.